warm afternoon in late December 2011, a dark sedan rolled slowly through Nickerson Gardens near 114th Street. Windows cracked just enough for two young men to watch the courtyard closely. As the car eased past a group posted near the walkway, both doors swung open together, and shots started ringing through the complex before anybody could even react properly. One man dropped right there on the concrete, while others scattered through stairwells and alley paths, and someone inside the car leaned back, yelling they got him before the driver pulled off. As neighbors rushed out screaming and a kid watched everything from a second-floor window, nobody on that block acted surprised, since moments like that had been happening for years without stopping. By the time police units reached the scene, asking questions, most people stayed quiet, and that silence said more than anything else about how deep the situation really ran. What happened that day was not random, and it was not new, which raises a bigger question about who really set the rules out there and how the same cycle kept replaying over decades. To understand that moment clearly, you have to go back before the shootings, before gangs took names, back when those buildings first went up and everything still looked different. Backstory: building the projects, 1940s, 1960s. Back in the early 1940s, long before anybody called these places dangerous, the land around Watts was getting reshaped by wartime demand as factories in Long Beach, Compton, and Inglewood needed workers fast. To handle that pressure, the federal government funded housing developments like Jordan Downs in 1944 with about 700 units, Imperial Courts that same year with just under 500 units, and later Nickerson Gardens in 1954, which became the largest public housing site in Los Angeles. These complexes were designed as low-rise buildings with open courtyards, grass patches, and simple walkways, giving families something that looked closer to a neighborhood rather than crowded city housing. Early residents included working families who had stable income from defense jobs, and many people who moved in felt like they finally had access to running water, indoor plumbing, and safer living conditions than the overcrowded areas they left behind. At that point, nobody was talking about gangs running blocks or shootouts happening in broad daylight, and the projects carried a reputation that leaned more toward opportunity than danger. As the war ended and factory demand slowed down, those same workers started leaving for better areas across Los Angeles County, and that shift slowly changed who stayed behind in those housing units. White families moved out toward places like the San Fernando Valley and Lakewood, while Black migrants from the South and Latino families with fewer options filled the vacancies left behind. That transition did not happen overnight, yet over time the projects became heavily concentrated with poor residents who had limited access to stable employment. Jobs that once supported entire households disappeared from nearby areas, and industries that used to hire locally either shut down or moved elsewhere, leaving many families struggling to keep a steady income. As economic pressure built across the neighborhood, the sense of isolation started growing stronger, especially for younger people who saw fewer ways out of their situation. What once felt like a stepping stone slowly turned into a place where people got stuck, and that shift shaped how the next generation viewed their environment. The layout of these developments played a quiet role in what came later, since the buildings were arranged in tight grids that allowed people to move quickly through courtyards, alleys, and connecting walkways without much obstruction. Narrow paths between units created blind spots where visibility dropped, and open spaces between buildings made it easy to watch who was coming in or leaving out at any given time. From a distance, the design looked calm and organized, yet on the ground, it gave anyone familiar with the area a serious advantage in movement and control. Police patrols could drive through main roads, although those intersections remained difficult to monitor consistently, especially at night or during large gatherings. Residents learned early how to navigate those spaces, and over time that knowledge became something more valuable than outsiders understood. That physical setup did not cause violence by itself, yet it made certain types of activity easier to carry out without interruption. At the same time, everyday conditions inside those communities started tightening in ways that affected how people lived, especially for younger residents growing up during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Schools serving the area were underfunded compared to other parts of Los Angeles, which meant larger class sizes, fewer resources, and limited opportunities for students trying to move forward. Police presence increased across South Los Angeles, although interactions often felt aggressive rather than supportive, and that created tension between officers and residents who already felt targeted. Families tried to maintain stability inside their homes, although outside those doors, the environment carried a different energy that was harder to control. Kids spent more time in courtyards, playgrounds, and street corners, forming tight bonds with others who lived within the same few blocks. Over time, those relationships became stronger than anything outside the neighborhood, and that shift changed how loyalty started to work among young people. As those bonds grew deeper, groups of teenagers began forming small crews that stayed close to their immediate surroundings, watching out for each other while also pushing back against outsiders who entered their space. What started as simple protection turned into something more defined, as certain areas became associated with specific groups, even before formal gang identities took shape. Names were not fully established yet, although reputations began spreading from one block to another based on who controlled which section of the projects. Conflicts at that stage stayed mostly contained, often involving fights or minor disputes that rarely escalated beyond the immediate participants. Still, those early moments carried weight, since they set patterns that would later expand into something much bigger and harder to control. By the early 1960s, the groundwork was already laid out, even if nobody fully realized how far things would go once pressure increased across the entire area. By August 1965, everything shifted when a traffic stop involving Marquette Fry on Avalon Boulevard turned into 6 days of unrest across Watts, leaving 34 people dead and over 1,000 injured. As National Guard troops rolled through South Los Angeles and entire blocks burned, tension between residents and the Los Angeles Police Department reached a level that changed how young people viewed authority. Families who had already felt pressure from poverty now saw open conflict playing out in front of them, and that moment pushed many teenagers to start looking for protection closer to home. Once the smoke cleared, trust did not come back, and neighborhoods that were already isolated became even more divided, which made it easier for local groups to form around shared experiences. What started as loose street clubs began tightening into something more organized, as young men who grew up together began setting boundaries that others were not supposed to cross. That shift did not happen all at once, although by the late 1960s, the streets were already moving in a different direction. Around 1969, Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams brought together different street groups across South Central Los Angeles, forming what became known as the Crips, and that identity quickly spread into housing projects. Inside Jordan Downs, the Grape Street Crips took shape as one of the earliest project-based sets, drawing young members who had grown up in the same courtyards and hallways. Over in Imperial Courts, the P.J. Watts Crips established their own presence, holding down blocks that sat only minutes away from rival areas, which made daily movement more tense than before. At the same time in Nickerson Gardens, the Bounty Hunter Bloods formed as a response to growing Crip influence, originally starting as a group called the Green Jackets, before taking on a more defined identity by the early 1970s. These groups did not just represent names, since they reflected real control over specific streets, buildings, and pathways that residents used every day. As each set grew stronger, crossing from one project to another started carrying risk, and that tension began shaping how people moved through their own neighborhoods. While those groups expanded in Watts, Latino gangs were building their own structure across South Los Angeles, especially along Florence Avenue, where Florencia 13 had already been active since the late 1940s. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Florencia 13 strengthened its position, pulling in younger members who saw the gang as a way to survive in an area where resources were limited and opportunities stayed scarce. Around the same time, 18th Street formed in the Rampart district after breaking away from Clanton 14, opening its doors to anyone regardless of background, which allowed it to grow faster than most other gangs. That decision made 18th Street different, since it brought together members from Mexican, Central American, and even Asian communities, creating a broader network across Los Angeles. As these groups expanded, they began forming connections beyond single blocks, linking neighborhoods that shared similar struggles and similar goals. Those alliances were not always stable, although they created a foundation for something much larger than what existed before. For many young people growing up during that period, joining a gang offered something they did not find anywhere else, especially when schools, jobs, and community programs failed to provide stability. Within those groups, members found structure, identity, and protection, which made loyalty feel more real than anything outside their immediate environment. Older members mentored younger ones, teaching them how to navigate streets, recognize threats, and defend territory when necessary. That system gave people a sense of purpose, even when it came with serious consequences that were not always clear at the beginning. Families often struggled to pull teenagers away from that life, especially when entire friend groups were moving in the same direction at the same time. What looked like a dangerous choice from the outside often felt like the only option from within those neighborhoods. During the early 1970s, violence started showing up more often, although it stayed limited compared to what would come later, as most conflicts involved fistfights, stabbings, or small confrontations that rarely escalated into full shootings. Disputes usually began over respect, territory, or personal issues, and those situations often ended before spreading beyond a few individuals. Even then, certain incidents carried weight, especially when someone got seriously injured or killed, which pushed others to respond in ways that kept tensions alive. Small retaliations began stacking up, creating patterns that would eventually grow into larger conflicts between entire sets. Law enforcement recorded rising gang activity across South Los Angeles during that period, although the scale had not yet reached its peak. People living in those areas could still move around with caution, though the sense of danger was already starting to build. As the decade moved forward, these groups began organizing more clearly, forming alliances that linked different sets under shared identities, which made their presence stronger across multiple neighborhoods. At the same time, rivalries started taking shape, especially between Crip and Blood sets and Watts, as well as between Latino gangs competing for control in nearby areas. Those divisions were not always immediate, although once they formed, they carried long-term consequences that affected how conflicts played out. Members started recognizing who was connected to which group, and that awareness changed how everyday interactions unfolded across streets and housing projects. What once felt like separate crews gradually turned into structured networks with defined enemies and allies, which made the environment more unpredictable than before. By the late 1970s, the streets had rules that people understood, although those rules were already shifting towards something far more dangerous than anyone had seen yet. By the early 1980s, the streets across Watts and South Central Los Angeles took a sharp turn when crack cocaine started spreading through neighborhoods that were already dealing with pressure from poverty and gang rivalry. Around 1981 through 1984, a figure named Ricky Donnell Ross, known on the streets as Freeway Rick Ross, began distributing crack across Los Angeles using connections tied to larger supply networks moving product into the city. His operation pushed large quantities into areas near Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Nickerson Gardens, where local gangs quickly became involved in distribution at the street level. What made crack different was not just how addictive it was, but how cheap it sold. As more people started buying, the project shifted from residential spaces into active marketplaces, where transactions happened openly in courtyards, stairwells, and parking areas. That shift changed everything about how gangs operated, since money started driving decisions more than reputation alone. Once that cash flow entered the picture, territory took on a new meaning, especially when specific corners inside housing projects became steady sources of income that crews refused to lose. In Jordan Downs, sections near 103rd Street turned into high traffic spots where dealers worked in shifts, while lookouts stood at entrances to alert others if police or rivals approached. Over in Nickerson Gardens, areas near 114th Street operated under similar setups, where younger members handled small sales while older figures managed supply and security. Those operations created structured systems, with roles assigned to different members, turning gangs into organized groups that functioned more like businesses than loose street crews. Conflicts that once started over respect now carried financial consequences, which meant losing territory could cut off income for entire groups. That pressure made every disagreement more serious, as gangs became more willing to defend their positions with force. What had been a local rivalry started turning into something closer to organized warfare. As the stakes increased, weapons followed the money, changing how conflicts played out across South Los Angeles during the mid-80s. Firearms like MAC-10s, Uzis, and semi-automatic rifles became more common among gang members, replacing the knives and fists that had defined earlier confrontations. Drive-by shootings became the preferred method of attack, with vehicles moving slowly through rival areas before unleashing bursts of gunfire at anyone identified as an enemy. That approach removed direct confrontation, allowing shooters to strike quickly and escape before police could respond. In one pattern described by residents in Watts, a single shooting could trigger multiple retaliations within hours, with cars circling back through the same streets looking for targets. Innocent people often got caught in those situations, as bullets fired from moving vehicles did not always hit the intended victims. That shift made the environment unpredictable, as danger could appear without warning at any moment. Daily life inside the projects adjusted to that level of violence. especially for families trying to protect children from becoming victims of stray gunfire. Parents kept kids indoors after sunset, while younger ones learned how to react when shots rang out, dropping low or running in zigzag patterns to avoid being hit. Windows stayed closed during the night, even during hot weather, as residents tried to prevent bullets from entering their homes. Streets that once held gatherings turned into spaces where people moved carefully, scanning for unfamiliar faces or suspicious vehicles. Schools near those neighborhoods reported students arriving late or missing classes after nights filled with gunfire, while hospitals saw increasing numbers of patients suffering from gunshot wounds tied to the same few areas. That constant exposure changed how people viewed their surroundings, replacing normal routines with survival instincts that shaped everyday decisions. Specific incidents during that period showed how quickly violence could escalate once retaliation cycles began, especially between major rival groups like Grape Street Crips and Bounty Hunter Bloods. In one sequence from the late 1980s, a shooting near Jordan Downs involving a Grape Street member triggered immediate retaliation from Nickerson Gardens, leading to multiple attacks within a single day. Vehicles moved back and forth between the two areas, with shooters firing into crowds or targeting individuals identified through prior conflicts. Witnesses described hearing gunfire throughout the day, with little time between one incident and the next, creating a sense that the entire neighborhood was under constant threat. Police struggled to respond effectively, as new shootings occurred before officers could finish processing earlier scenes. That pattern became common, where one act led to another without pause, reinforcing cycles that became harder to break over time. Violence during the crack era did not stay limited to rival groups, as internal discipline within gangs became more severe, especially when members were accused of breaking rules or cooperating with authorities. In documented cases from South Los Angeles during the late 1980s, individuals suspected of disloyalty were attacked by their own associates inside housing units, sometimes resulting in death. Those punishments served as warnings to others, reinforcing expectations that members follow orders without question. Loyalty became essential for survival, as stepping out of line could lead to consequences as serious as those faced from rival gangs. Younger members witnessed those actions and understood early what was expected of them, which kept the system running even as older figures were arrested or killed. Once someone became part of that structure, leaving it carried risks that many were not willing to take. The emotional impact of that period spread across families and communities, especially as funerals became regular events attended by large groups of relatives and friends. Young men often expected short lifespans, expressing that mindset openly through conversations or tattoos, honoring those who had already died. Mothers buried sons before they reached adulthood, while younger siblings grew up watching that pattern repeat around them. Community leaders attempted to intervene, although their efforts struggled against the scale of violence fueled by money and territory disputes. Stories from that time describe individuals attending multiple funerals within a single month, each connected to the same ongoing conflicts. Over time, that repetition changed how people process loss, turning tragedy into something expected rather than shocking. By the end of the 1980s and moving into the early 1990s, the numbers reflected how widespread the situation had become, with Los Angeles recording hundreds of gang-related homicides each year, many concentrated in areas surrounding housing projects. In 1992 alone, more than 800 gang-related killings were reported across the city, marking one of the most violent periods in its history. Watts neighborhoods, including Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, and Imperial Courts, played a major role in those figures, as ongoing conflicts continued without resolution. Law enforcement increased pressure through operations like Operation Hammer, although arrests and sweeps did not stop the underlying cycle of retaliation. What began as localized disputes in earlier decades had evolved into a continuous system of violence, driven by money, territory, and survival. By that point, the transformation was complete, and what residents experienced daily was no longer occasional conflict, but a constant state of danger that defined life inside those communities. By April 1987, after a deadly drive-by shooting at a birthday party in South Central Los Angeles, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates launched what became known as Operation Hammer, flooding neighborhoods with officers in numbers rarely seen before. Over 1,000 officers moved through Watts, Compton, and surrounding areas, stopping cars, raiding homes, and sweeping entire blocks near Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Nickerson Gardens. During one major weekend in April 1988, police arrested 1,453 people in a single operation, although records later showed only a small number faced felony charges after booking. Officers used gang databases, field identification cards, and street stops to track young Black and Latino men, often placing names into records even without evidence of criminal activity. Those sweeps did not focus only on active suspects, as entire groups of teenagers found themselves detained simply for standing outside buildings or walking through their own neighborhoods. What looked like a war on gangs quickly expanded into something broader, affecting residents who had no direct involvement in street conflicts. As those operations continued through the late 1980s, the community reaction shifted from cautious acceptance to open frustration, especially when families saw relatives arrested and released without explanation. Residents in areas like Nickerson Gardens described officers lining people against walls, searching them publicly, then moving on without filing charges, which created a sense that everyone was being treated as a suspect. Parents worried about their sons getting caught in sweeps simply for being outside after dark, while younger kids watched those encounters and learned early how police operated in their neighborhood. Complaints of excessive force increased during that period, with reports of officers damaging property during raids or using aggressive tactics during routine stops. What made the situation worse was that those actions did not reduce the level of violence taking place, which left residents dealing with both gang activity and constant police pressure. Over time, that combination eroded trust to the point where cooperation with law enforcement became rare, even when serious crimes occurred. Inside police units assigned to gang enforcement, a different culture developed, especially within the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums unit known as CRASH, which operated across divisions, including Rampart. Officers in that unit were tasked with targeting gangs like 18th Street, Florencia 13, and other groups active in central Los Angeles, although their methods often crossed legal boundaries. Reports from the late 1990s described CRASH officers planting weapons on suspects, falsifying reports, and using force during interrogations that went far beyond standard procedures. In one incident from February 1998, Officer Brian Hewitt brought Ismael Jimenez, an 18th Street member, into an interrogation room where he beat him repeatedly while the suspect was handcuffed, leaving him vomiting blood before being taken to a hospital. Those actions were not isolated, as internal investigations later uncovered patterns of misconduct involving multiple officers working within the same unit. What was supposed to be a focused effort against gang violence started turning into something that mirrored the aggression seen on the streets. The situation escalated further when Officer Rafael Perez was arrested in August 1998 for stealing cocaine from an evidence locker, which opened the door to one of the largest police corruption scandals in Los Angeles history. During questioning, Perez began describing how officers in Rampart CRASH planted evidence, committed perjury, and covered up shootings involving unarmed suspects. One of the most serious cases involved Javier Ovando, an 18th Street member who was shot by Perez and his partner Nino Durden on October 12, 1996, inside an apartment building in Rampart. After shooting Ovando and leaving him paralyzed, the officers planted a firearm on him, claimed he had fired first, and secured a conviction that sent him to prison for 23 years. Ovando remained incarcerated until Perez confessed to the truth, which led to his release and the overturning of his conviction. That case exposed how deeply corruption had spread, especially when similar patterns appeared across dozens of other arrests handled by the same unit. As the Rampart scandal unfolded, investigators identified more than 70 officers connected to misconduct, leading to over 100 convictions being overturned across Los Angeles County. Civil lawsuits followed, costing the city over $100 million in settlements tied to wrongful arrests, excessive force, and fabricated charges. Residents in neighborhoods already dealing with gang violence saw those revelations as confirmation of what they had been saying for years about police behavior. Stories that once sounded like exaggerations began matching official records, which made it harder for law enforcement to rebuild credibility in those communities. At the same time, gangs continued operating across housing projects, maintaining control over territory despite increased policing efforts. That overlap created a situation where neither side fully controlled the environment, leaving residents caught between two forces that both carried risk. For people living inside places like Jordan Downs or Nickerson Gardens, daily life meant navigating that dual pressure, where stepping outside could bring contact with either gang members or police units running operations through the area. Some residents described hearing gunfire at night followed by early morning raids, creating a cycle that never fully stopped. Teenagers learned how to avoid both situations, adjusting routines based on where police units were stationed or which blocks were active that day. In some cases, individuals faced danger from gangs if they cooperated with law enforcement, while also facing arrest if they refused to engage during police questioning. That position left many people choosing silence as the safest option, even when serious crimes occurred in their immediate surroundings. Over time, that pattern reinforced itself, as lack of cooperation made investigations harder, which led to more aggressive policing tactics. On the streets, perceptions shifted in a way that placed police alongside gangs as another force to watch out for, rather than a source of protection. Conversations among residents often framed encounters with law enforcement in the same cautious tone used for rival groups, especially when interactions turned physical or confrontational. Stories of wrongful arrests, planted evidence, and excessive force spread quickly through neighborhoods, shaping how younger generations viewed authority. That mindset affected everything from reporting crimes to testifying in court, since many people believed involvement would create more problems rather than solve existing ones. Even when officers attempted community outreach later on, the damage from earlier actions made it difficult to rebuild trust in a meaningful way. As a result, the relationship between law enforcement and residents remained strained across decades, influencing how both sides approached each encounter. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles reached one of its most violent periods, with gang-related homicides peaking while police activity remained high across affected neighborhoods. Despite thousands of arrests and ongoing operations, shootings continued in areas surrounding housing projects, showing that enforcement alone did not resolve the underlying conflicts. Instead, pressure from both gangs and police created an environment where residents felt trapped between two sources of danger that operated under different rules. Families tried to maintain normal routines, although the constant presence of violence and law enforcement activity made stability difficult to achieve. What started as an effort to control gang activity turned into a broader conflict that shaped how entire communities lived and interacted with authority. By that point, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond simple enforcement, as both sides continued pushing against each other without bringing lasting change. By early 1992, after years of non-stop retaliation between Grape Street Crips, P.J. Watts Crips, and Bounty Hunter Bloods, something unexpected started forming inside Watts as key figures quietly opened communication lines. Aquila Sherrills, a former Grape Street member, along with his brother Dodge Sherrills, began organizing sit-downs with representatives from rival sets who had spent years shooting at each other across Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Nickerson Gardens. Those meetings did not happen in public view, as they took place inside apartments, churches, and back rooms where discussions focused on how many people had already been buried over the previous decade. Instead of arguing over territory, the conversation shifted toward survival, especially after the crack era left entire blocks dealing with constant funerals and exhausted families. By April 28, 1992, just one day before the Rodney King verdict triggered unrest across Los Angeles, those groups reached an agreement that became known as the Watts Truce, marking one of the first real attempts to stop the violence from inside the streets themselves. For a short period, that agreement changed how life felt inside the projects, as movement between rival territories became possible without immediate confrontation. Residents described people from Jordan Downs walking through Nickerson Gardens without being pressed, while families visited relatives across project lines that once carried serious risk. Drive-by shootings dropped noticeably, and younger kids experienced a brief window where gunfire did not dominate every night. The truth showed that the same people driving the violence also had the power to reduce it, which gave the community a sense of control that had not existed during the late 1980s. Support from figures like Jim Brown and the Amir ICANN program helped reinforce the message, pushing gang members toward accountability and discipline. For a moment, it looked like the cycle might actually slow down. That calm did not last long, as internal disputes and unresolved rivalries began weakening the agreement almost immediately after it took hold. By 1994, Tony Bogard, a P.J. Watts Crip who played a role in maintaining order, was shot and killed during a conflict tied to internal issues, showing that unity inside gangs was already breaking down. At the same time, tensions between Grape Street Crips and Bounty Hunter Bloods started rising again, driven by past grievances that had never been fully resolved. Younger members who did not experience the worst years of the crack era felt less connected to the truce, which made it easier for them to ignore its terms. retaliation patterns returned quickly, with shootings reported again near 103rd Street, 114th Street, and surrounding areas. By the mid-1990s, the agreement had lost its strength, and the streets began sliding back into the same rhythm that defined the previous decade. As violence escalated in Watts, another conflict spread across South Los Angeles, where Black and Latino gangs fought over overlapping territories. During the 1990s, Florencia 13 became increasingly aggressive after strengthening ties with the Mexican mafia. At the same time, the East Coast Crips expanded drug operations near Avalon Boulevard, bringing both groups into direct conflict. The robbery of a Florencia-linked drug stash house triggered a cycle of retaliatory shootings that quickly spread beyond individual neighborhoods. By the late 1990s, Florencia 13 increasingly targeted East Coast Crips as prison leadership sought control of key drug corridors. Investigators also linked several shootings to attacks on Black residents who had no confirmed gang involvement, giving the conflict a racial dimension. In one case, a gunman approached a Black man at a bus stop, shouted gang slurs, and opened fire, demonstrating how the violence had expanded beyond rival gang members. One of the decade's deadliest attacks occurred on May 5, 1993, when members of the 18th Street gang set fire to a 3-story apartment building at 330 South Burlington Avenue in Westlake during a dispute connected to drug activity. The building housed immigrant families in overcrowded conditions with limited escape routes. As flames spread, residents broke windows, dropped children to people below, and ran through smoke-filled hallways while firefighters rescued victims suffering severe burns and smoke inhalation. The fire killed 10 people, including 7 children and 2 pregnant women, making it one of Los Angeles' deadliest gang-related attacks. Investigators concluded it was retaliation tied to gang-controlled drug operations. Witnesses initially stayed silent out of fear, but years later arrests were made, showing how gang violence reached far beyond housing projects. Throughout the 1990s, fear spread across Watts, Florence Firestone, Pico Union, and Westlake. Residents avoided certain streets. Police increased enforcement after major incidents, and community programs struggled to compete with the money and identity gangs provided. Although the Watts Truce briefly proved peace was possible, it collapsed without lasting support. Conflicts involving Florencia 13 and the East Coast Crips evolved beyond territorial disputes into organized crime and racial violence, while tragedies like the Westlake arson showed that innocent families often paid the highest price. By the early 2000s, Los Angeles redeveloped several housing projects, replacing older complexes with mixed-income communities. Many former residents could not return, spreading gang members and long-standing rivalries into new neighborhoods. The buildings changed, but the criminal networks adapted instead of disappearing. The pattern continued around Rancho San Pedro, where members clashed with the Dodge City Crips, increasing racial tensions between Latino and Black residents. In 1995, Angelo Regino killed a Black man while wearing a Freddy Krueger mask, intensifying hostilities and demonstrating that project-based gang conflicts had spread well beyond Watts. In Boyle Heights, Big Hazard controlled Ramona Gardens for decades. In 2007, Mauricio Cornejo died after a traffic stop in which police claimed he resisted arrest, while witnesses alleged he was beaten after being handcuffed. His death sparked protests and a tense standoff with police. Years later, Big Hazard members carried out Molotov cocktail attacks targeting Black families living in Ramona Gardens. Federal investigators later identified gang leader Carlos Hernandez as directing the attacks, and he was sentenced in 2021, confirming the violence was organized and racially motivated. As gangs evolved, organizations like Florencia 13 expanded ties with the Mexican mafia, allowing prison leaders to direct street operations. Drug trafficking, extortion, and illegal gambling houses known as casitas became major sources of income, with violence used to protect those networks. Around MacArthur Park during the 2020s, investigators uncovered an open-air drug market where 18th Street members used homeless encampments to hide methamphetamine and fentanyl sales. Federal indictments in 2026 charged multiple suspects with racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder, proving the structure behind the violence had remained intact despite changing locations. Looking back at the December 2011 shooting in Nickerson Gardens, it becomes clear the attack was the product of decades of retaliation rather than a single event. From the late 1960s through the crack era, failed truces, police crackdowns, redevelopment, and organized crime, each generation inherited the rivalries of the last. Unlike Chicago's isolated high-rise projects, Los Angeles' housing developments blended into surrounding neighborhoods, allowing violence to spread through everyday life. For families, the consequences lasted across generations as children inherited the same streets, histories, and conflicts that shaped those before them.